So now that the shots are fired at Lexington and Concord and war is inevitable, the colonists now have a major decision to make. On May 10th, 1775, Ethan Allen and Benedict Arnold led a militia attack on Fort Ticonderoga. This militia was called the Green Mountain Boys, and they end up surprising the sleeping British, and they capture the fort without firing a single shot. And this really gives colonial forces an advantage early on in what becomes the American Revolution. They were able to capture the artillery, which are the large guns that can fire over long distances, along with cannons and other pieces of heavy artillery. Now, I know what some of you are probably thinking. You've heard the name Benedict Arnold before. He's going to be a very interesting and controversial figure throughout the American Revolution. In the beginning of the American Revolution, he is considered a great hero, and we're going to hear about him at some other very important battles. Also on May 10th, 1775, the Second Continental Congress meets. This is a group of leaders of the American colonies who met to address the problem of British tyranny and end up declaring independence in 1776 and led the United States through the American Revolution. They meet in Philadelphia. Many of the delegates had attended the First Continental Congress, but now they include a famous writer, a very well-known writer and politician from Virginia, Thomas Jefferson, and a man, maybe the most famous man, from the colonies, Benjamin Franklin. They realize the colonies need to prepare for war, and they end up appointing George Washington as the commander-in-chief of the Continental Army. These troops become the Continental Army, which is the American Army formed in 1775 by the Second Continental Congress and led by General George Washington. We actually celebrated their 250th birthday this past May. One of the early battles of the war following Lexington and Concord and the capture of Fort Ticonderoga is the Battle of Bunker Hill. There was militia around Boston, and they learned that the British were planning to take control of the hills overlooking the city. You want the high ground when you're in a war. So on June 16th, troops of militiamen end up taking Bunker Hill and Breed's Hill to prevent the British from succeeding. Most of the fighting will actually happen on Breed's Hill. Why it's not the Battle of Breed's Hill, I don't know. But on June 17th, the British attack. And so the British are trying to come up the high ground towards the peak of this high ground. And the Americans, I mean, they have an advantage, right? They have the advantage that these guys are ascending up this hill. The British are outnumbered, the British outnumber the Americans, and the Americans don't have a lot of ammunition, right? They have never needed it. And the famous "don't fire until you see the whites of their eyes" from Colonel William Prescott is said at this famous battle. Now, that is most likely some mythology, but it still is pretty heroic. So the British tried to charge up this hill 3 times. The first 2 attempts failed. On the 3rd attempt, however, the Patriots are overrun. Britain ends up winning this battle, but at an enormous cost. Okay, an enormous cost. Hundreds of British soldiers lay dead after this. And again, it's called the Battle of Bunker Hill, but the majority of the fighting had happened on Breed's Hill. Go ahead and pause and answer the question. What happened at the battles of Fort Ticonderoga and Bunker Hill? 2, why did the Second Continental Congress decide to prepare for war? And do you think peace between Britain and the colonies could have been possible in 1775? Why or why not? And again, not a right or wrong answer. Just make sure you use some evidence. So 1775, the Continental Congress, which again was meeting in Philadelphia, made moves towards peace and war. So first, they send a petition to the king. They're still trying to solve this problem diplomatically. They asked him to resolve the conflict between the colonies and Parliament. And instead, he declared that the colonies were in open and avowed rebellion. So what ends up happening is the Continental Congress decides that they are going to kind of, fine, you're saying we're in rebellion, we're actually going to rebel. So we end up sending an army north to try and invade Canada. This was an incredibly poor decision. It was a long and bloody campaign. We lost a lot of patriots, and it was unsuccessful. So eventually the Americans are pushed back by the British to New York. In December of 1775, Parliament punishes the colonies by cutting off all trade. And so they're hoping by doing this, where else are the colonies going to get the things they need to wage a war against Britain? In January, King George III signs a treaty with Germany. So we're already outnumbered by the Redcoats, but the British are also essentially going to be fighting this war around the world, just as they had in the French and Indian War. So by signing this treaty, it allows him to hire 20,000 German soldiers to fight for Britain. And these German soldiers are called Hessians. Okay, they were hired by the British to fight during the American Revolution, and they had a reputation of being incredibly fierce. Britain intended to crush the colonies militarily and economically. The colonial army, while being, driven back from Canada, are seeing success in Boston. In summer of 1775, Washington had arrived, and he was determined to drive the British from Boston. In the winter of 1775, he sends troops to drag heavy guns from Fort Ticonderoga and install them on the high ground overlooking Boston. This is an incredible feat, okay? And he sends a man by the name of Henry Knox, or was it Knox or Green? Oh, I should know that. We'll talk about it in class. But anyway, he sends one of these gentlemen out to Fort Ticonderoga, and it is in a heavily wooded, rocky terrained area, and they drag these heavy guns into Boston. And in the spring of 1776, the British actually end up leaving Boston, and they sail north to Canada to kind of regroup. And more than 1,000 loyalists are left in the city too when the British depart. They obviously don't fare too well in a Patriot-controlled city. Alarmed by this turn of events, the British send more troops to put down the revolt. There are 400 ships carrying 32,000 troops, and this is including Hessians. What they end up doing is they end up joining the British troops into Canada, and their plan is to attack New York City. Now, New York City at this point is a very, very important shipping center. Warships are going to attack seaports to disrupt colonial shipping, and New York is the first on the list. So in January of 1776, while the colonies are still teetering on this idea of rebellion, yes, there are skirmishes and battles happening, but the large majority of colonists are still not sure about fighting a war against the most powerful country in the world. Okay? Well, that changes when this guy, Thomas Paine, publishes a pamphlet called Common Sense. Essentially, in his pamphlet, Paine argues the case for independence. He claims that France and Spain would only aid the colonies if they split from Britain. Remember, they need to get supplies from somebody. And he also claimed that European countries would continue to purchase American exports if they left Britain. Go ahead and pause and answer these questions. Which events in 1775 and 1776 led the colonies toward independence? And why did the British government respond with overwhelming force to events in North America? And what was the colonial response? 3. What was Thomas Paine's principal argument in favor of independence? So this brings us up to spring of 1776. Again, remember Thomas Paine's pamphlet Common Sense comes out in January. In the spring, the Continental Congress declared American ports would accept ships from any country except Great Britain. This encouraged colonies to establish their own independent governments so that they can make trade agreements with other countries. On June 7th, Richard Henry Lee, who was a very well-known politician from Virginia, submits a resolution to declare independence from Britain. Many were not in favor of this, but Congress appoints a committee to draft this resolution. And so they developed the Committee of Five. Thomas Jefferson, who ends up being the principal author. Again, a well-known writer, eloquent writer. John Adams, who is the lawyer from Massachusetts. He's actually the one who proposes Jefferson writing this draft. You have Ben Franklin, again, well-known statesman. He's from Pennsylvania. He gives advice and helps revise that draft. And then you also have Robert R. Livingston and Roger Sherman. Roger Sherman actually is going to play a very important role when we get to the Constitutional Convention, and he is the only founding father who is there for all of the big principal early events in American history, including the Declaration of Independence, the passage of the Articles of Confederation, and the Constitutional Convention. So on July 2nd, 1776, the Committee of Five introduces this resolution, and the Continental Congress voted to approve independence from Britain. On July 4th, 1776, they adopt this document, which is now known as the Declaration of Independence, the document that declares U.S. independence from Great Britain. Many of the ideas in the Declaration of Independence can be traced to John Locke. We had talked about him earlier when we were talking about some of the religious revivals that were happening. He was a philosopher in Europe, and he's the guy who believed that people are born with rights. Naturally, when you're born, everybody, no matter man, woman, white, black, didn't matter. You all had rights. And so that's where we see him, is in the preamble of the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Remember that unalienable rights are rights that cannot be taken away. However, there are two groups who are omitted, and those are enslaved people and women. And there are more than two groups, okay? Native Americans obviously are not included in this as well. There's also quite a bit of arguing about other citizens from other countries and those kinds of things. Thomas Jefferson, who was a slave owner, had listed slavery as one of the king's offenses. There's a whole list of grievances in the Declaration of Independence. But after intense debate, it was removed. And mainly this is to appease the South. The Declaration excluded women, even though John Adams' wife, Abigail, had pleaded with him to remember the ladies and be more generous and favorable to them than his ancestors had been. And the second part of the document, which listed the offenses the king had committed against the colonies, is the longest portion of the Declaration of Independence. And for these reasons, Congress declared that the 13 colonies would be free and independent states and would be called the United States of America.